Dave, will you share with us what is your moment of impact?
My moment of impact, at the risk of sounding overly specific, uh, was on July 9th, 2010. And it was in the middle of the night. I actually became a dad for the first time. And that obviously has an impact on most people when they bring a new life into the world. It took on an added importance for my wife and me because our daughter was born with some health issues. She had a congenital heart defect that we knew about leading into the birth, but required some real support for her as she came into the world. And why that was beyond just the maybe the generic rationale for why that was impactful for me in terms of fatherhood. I think in a lot of ways it led to me changing how I looked at the world in the sense of being somebody who was less solely focused on career, less focused on some of the more symbolic milestones of who you work for, what your title is, how much money you make, and more about like how am I going to help this person make it into the world, and how am I going to be a good example for her as she does that. And so I think I started to really become somebody that was more motivated by serving other people through what it is that I did. And I started to take a much harder look at who I was as a person as I did that, and what it was that inspired and motivated me to be the type of person that I was proud of.
I love that so much, and I think so many people can relate to that first time experience of becoming a parent. I know I can. I'm the mom of 3 sons, and I remember so vividly calling my parents after I saw the ultrasound of my first son with the heartbeat, and then they gave like a little photo that you could take home with you.
Yeah.
And it just made the whole thing so real. So talk to us for a minute about, like, it sounds like you were aware before the delivery that your firstborn was going to have some medical challenges. So that sounds like that was a very emotional and complex experience. Take us into that situation.
So Katie, it was, and I'd say we ended up doing some testing as part of preparing for Catherine's birth, and we did some genetic testing while she was in utero because my wife Amanda has a congenital heart defect herself, and so through that testing we learned that Catherine was going to have some issues, and while that certainly was helpful in that there was time to prepare, there was a lot of ambiguity around what it meant in terms of how it was going to present when she came, and the doctors were really preparing us for her immediately going into the NICU and potentially requiring surgery within a week of her birth. So there was a lot of stress in and around that event. Fortunately, she ended up needing to stay in the NICU for a couple of weeks after her birth, but she did not require surgery within the first few weeks, and in fact didn't end up requiring surgery for over 6 years, and it ended up being a real blessing in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So, for anybody listening that's expecting, what do you remember about holding your daughter, Katherine, for the first time in your arms? What did
Yeah,
that
it
feel
was a
like?
unique. I mean, I've now had the benefit of having three children, including Catherine, and Catherine's birth was really unique in the sense that there were probably 10 people in the room. And at the time, we were living in Chicago, and the NICU was not connected to the hospital where she was born. So there were literally men in spacesuits waiting for her to be born. We did get to hold her for a few minutes, and then they took her, transported her in an ambulance to the NICU a couple of miles away from where the hospital was that she was born in. So it was a fairly rushed experience, and then I actually went to the NICU and spent the next 24 hours there while my wife Amanda was recovering. So it was a very rushed experience, for lack of a better word.
So, when you shared your moment of impact, that very specific moment when Catherine came into the world as the beautiful young lady that she is, you shared how it kind of reframed your perspective about what's important to you. And, you instantly become a father and you look at the world differently. So, Dave, how has that shaped the impact you care about?
Well, so I think, and while that moment truly is, I think the catalyst, it's led to, I think, years of figuring out what that means, and starting with the moment that Catherine was born, and then really leading into somebody who's figuring out family, career, and community over the course of these past 15 years. And I think in some respects, um, my perspective on the type of impact I want to have in this world is one that is broadened, it's one that includes that healthy cross section of family, having some purpose around what it is that I'm doing with my work, and actually making the world a better place through the community that I'm involved in. And I think being a dad has enabled me to do that in some different ways, from coaching my kids' teams to getting involved in the school that they go to, or the schools that they've gone to getting to know people in the area that we live in. And then some of that has been very conscious. Over the course of time, I've sought to find nonprofit nonprofits in the areas that I've lived in that align with some of what I believe in, and I've given my time in those ways. And then I'd say from a professional perspective, I've relied more on, I think increasingly I've relied more on my own skills and the brand that I'm creating in and around what I do versus the badge that comes with working for big companies. And there's been a certain amount of exploration that's come with that, and working with companies of different sizes. And then been there's been a certain amount of confidence that I've needed to build in myself to be able uh, to sort of do that in a way that allows me to make a living. And today, that's how I work. I have my own consultancy, where I built my own clientele, and I consistently look to find and seek out new engagements and deepen the ones that I have. And I've been able to do that really over the past 6 or 7 years in a pretty consistent way. I started my career having worked for big Fortune 500 companies. And I think in a lot of ways, when I was in my 20s and 30s, I thought, I'll continue to grow my career in that way and be part of bigger organizations. And over these past 15 years, I've gone in an entirely different direction.
Yeah, this is exactly why I was so excited to have you on the podcast, because you're a quintessential example of a leader who is service and advocacy first. And you've been very adaptable. You have many chapters to your career. And I love how your anchor is always service to your family, to your wife Amanda, and to your kids, and how that's the through line of your life. So tell me a little bit about what sports you coached, and then let's start unpacking your professional career. So what sports do you coach?
So over the course of time, I'm a fairly simple creature, I'd say. I grew up playing a handful of sports, but the two that I played most competitively were soccer and basketball, and those are the two sports that I have coached with my kids. And so I've kind of gravitated to what I know as a coach. But it's been something that has been really gratifying in the sense that it's allowed me to get to know, not only spend more time with my kids, but to get to know their friends and to get to know others in the communities that I've lived in at different moments in time. And team sports in particular for me were very defining. And I think in a lot of ways it helped form some of the qualities in the value system that I have. And so it's been getting involved in that way has been a great way for me to stay true to those things.
Yes, because your kids look at you a certain way around the home, but then when they see their peers look at you and take the advice that you offer as a coach and how you inspire the team, it really lets your kids see a different facet of you. So I really love that you invest in coaching.
For sure. And I say that your kids don't always listen to you when you're the quote unquote coach and
Right.
figuring out how to draw those lines between dad and coach are not always clean.
Yeah, I'm a mom of three grown sons, and I remember the eye rolling phases. And it was really great when their peers would be like, yeah, but your mom's really cool. And I would really, really lean into that to get through those eye rolling interludes. So you have had a super fascinating career, which is still ongoing with DNA Business Consulting. And you started your career with some really big name firms like Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, National City, Google, Publicis Groupe, the list goes on. And then you pivoted and became a very successful serial entrepreneur. And a lot of our listeners and viewers are facing a corporate market that's increasingly challenging right now. And a lot of them have a glimmer in their eye of, you know what? I love to work for myself. I wonder if that side hustle, that idea could really have legs and scale. So talk to us a little bit about maybe how you pivoted from being so successful in corporate to being an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and I'd love to tell you that I had it all planned out, and it was part of a master pivot.
Right.
But as often happens in careers, these things happen in phases, and I'd say in some ways that what I did was a test, and in others it actually, kind of tying it back to Katherine, I was working for a mid-sized marketing agency and leading their sales and business development efforts, and I was having to travel quite extensively as part of that role. And we had moved back to the Pittsburgh area within a couple of years of this moment in time. And we came to realize that Katherine was actually going to require the open heart surgery. And it was something that was going to have to be planned out within the year. And so I started to really take a hard look at whether the role that I was in and the amount of travel that I was doing could actually work in the year that was to come for us. And I was fortunate to have found a very wise consultant who I worked with, who helped me think through what it is that I might be able to do outside of what I was doing at that time. And through some of that work that in some ways was really more reflective, I think I learned about myself that one of the things that I enjoyed the most was solving problems and being consultative as part of doing that. And as much as I enjoyed relationships and selling and being a part of helping businesses to grow, it was really the problem solving thing that got me the most excited. And so I stepped back and I started to think about almost like as a thought experiment, if I were to do that, what would an offering kind of look like?
Mm-hmm.
And then I actually took that a step further and I started to map that out into a website. I once I did that, I actually built the confidence to say, you know what, I'm actually going to go take a crack at this. And I left the job that I had and started to talk to my network about me plugging in and helping them as a consultant in my own business. And fortunately, within 3 or 4 months, I was able to start to work with a couple of clients that were willing to pay me. And that sort of launched the consultancy practice that I operate today.
I really want to underscore that because that's so relatable, and while you didn't have it all figured out, you leaned into a set of principles that really served you. When you talk about how the initial impetus was a recognition that you were on the road a lot and this wasn't going to work for your family, specifically with some events that were going to unfold in the coming year. And then that caused you to reflect about, okay, if I'm going to change this up, what do I really love to do, right? And sometimes people think, well, just the thing that I'm good at, that's the thing I have to do. But you're probably good at lots of things. And the thing that you love to do really should be the core or, the germplasm for the business that's going to take root and blossom, to use a plant metaphor. So when you came in and said, well, you know what, I really love problem solving. That's the core of what I love to do. I like to do these other things around it, but that's what I want to build the business around.
I'd say too, I think, and maybe this could be helpful for others, but at that point in my career, my experiences had been somewhat nonlinear in that I had worked in finance and operations and client services and sales and then in marketing. And I think my gift was that I had experiences in all of those things and I could bring them together, but I wasn't somebody that had spent 15 to 20 years in one. And so you almost feel like, to use a sports metaphor, you feel like an athlete without a sport. And I think in going through that exercise and thought experiment around, well, if I were to actually have a consulting firm, what would it look like? Started to realize that my strength might be in how I help people to bring those things together versus being somebody who was just the 100-yard dash expert who could come in and help them close the sale exclusively.
Yeah, just to stay on your metaphor of athlete without a sport and how your varied experiences actually gave you breadth in addition to depth. I think that's so important now because with augmented AI
Yeah.
and what we're facing globally with the speed of change and disruption, agility is so crucial. And so being the athlete that can drop into any sport or drop into any professional context is really important. The other thing I really want to underscore about what you said earlier is that you went from thought experiment to 3D reality. So you basically said, you know what, I'm going to do the things I do if I really were going to have this be my plan. I'm actually going to build a website. I'm actually going to start conversations with peers that I know that might want to hire me for my services. And I think this is so important, folks, because that's what creates momentum. When you get out of ideation and you get into building the thing and bringing it into 3D reality, that's when it really starts to take off. So,
Absolutely. And I'd say, I mean, I'm sure I'm not alone. I'm somebody who I think has struggled with anxiety at different moments in my life. And what I have found is that action is the antidote for anxiety, right? If you're worried about what's to come and your mind starts to race, the best way to beat it back is to figure out what you can do about it. And I'd say that moment was really instructive for me in that way professionally, and that's been something that I've tried to take into my life in other ways.
and when you talk about the manifestation of your impact, you talk about how focusing on your family, becoming a father, and wanting to serve and advocate for others has really informed your whole professional outlook, not just your personal outlook. So I'm curious, how has your definition of leadership changed over the years?
My thoughts on leadership really focus more on what I needed from somebody else, and setting. I felt like if I set the right example, if I defined the right goals and held the expectations to where they ought to be, that I'd be bringing the best out of that person or that set of people. I think where I've evolved is that I start more by thinking about how can I help you, and what is it that you want to achieve, and how are you thinking about things, right? And building from there, and I think that has a fundamentally different level of effectiveness, and has an effectiveness with a wider range of people. I think that earlier in my career and stylistically, how I sort of viewed and looked at things, there was a certain type of person that I could influence and impact. I think that over the course of time and with how I've adapted my style, I think I can impact a wider range of people and personality type.
That's a fascinating description of something I can so relate to, where I came up professionally in the era of hierarchy and authority-based roles. And what you're describing is you have evolved. How can I help you? Like, who doesn't want their boss, their peer, their teammate to open up with, how can I help you? And I think when we're willing to create a safe space for the people around us to be vulnerable and actually say the real truth of what they really are struggling with, it's great for them. It's great for the mentoring relationship, but it's also great for the organization, right? Because we're humans and we are struggling with things. And if we can feel safe being open about what's challenging for us, no one around us is a mind reader, then we can actually get the kind of help that we can get. So I really appreciate how you describe your leadership ethos. How do you stay connected to your purpose? So a lot of what you said when you framed the impact you care about is you were able to select some things as super important and throw away some things as not so important. And how do you stay connected to purpose? You've got 3 kids, you're working full time, you're busy, you're coaching, you do community service, you're on nonprofit boards. What's your secret?
Well, I'd love to tell you that I have it all figured out. I don't. I will tell you what has helped me, and that is, and I think oftentimes when we're in the throes of the stage of life I'm at, you can almost lose yourself. And for me, what I've tried to do, especially over the past, call it 3 or 4 years, I have a really good friend who has gotten involved in life coaching, was a former professional athlete, and he has really helped me to hone in on identifying just 3 core things about who I am that give me energy in how I operate, that give me purpose in my work, and that help me understand what's important in my relationships. And I come back to those 3 things. And for me, I have always seen myself as an athlete. I like to work out and be active. I've done probably an inconsistent job of that as a parent at different moments in time, but over these past 3 or 4 years, that's been something that I've really tried to carve out time for myself. And then when it comes to those other things, I really try to focus on what it is that can help me to be a bold and empathetic leader in the work that I do. I try to identify the most important thing or set of things that I'm going to do in a particular day. And then I try to focus on being a caring and present dad and partner. And I just try to keep it as simple as that. I do think that for many men in particular, they can struggle in the sense that maintaining friendships and really having relationships outside of that core can sometimes fall as we get older. And I've tried to identify those close friends in my life and make sure that I connect with them and other members of my family. And I try to keep it as close to the. I try to align what I'm doing as closely as I can to that, from a who is Dave Babst perspective.
Who is Dave Babst? Speaking the truth here. So I've known you for probably a decade, and when you talk about how you focus on your energy, maintaining your energy, aligning with your purpose, staying centered with your values, and then building deep and meaningful connections professionally, but also personally, those friendships and the male friendships are so important to have a place to be vulnerable and share. And that's the basic human need, right? We need to be seen, heard, and acknowledged, and everything else flows from that. So thank you so much for sharing that. And that is who you are, Dave. So let's talk a little bit about DNA Business Consulting. So tell me about, what types of clients you serve, what the focus of your work is, and let's go there.
Yeah, so DNA Business Consulting has really evolved over the course of time to where it started out as more of a consultancy that focused on strategic planning and sales leadership to now it's really more holistic around how a business is going to grow and what the levers are that can help a business to do that. It's focused on serving B2B companies that tend to be technology based or professional services firms. I've aligned actually with a firm called GTM Partners that has developed an operating system around accelerating growth. I'm a certified implementation specialist in and around that operating system. So I look to bring that to clients through workshops and through initially consultations that ultimately tend to lead to either a key deliverable like a strategic plan or what's more commonly referred to in these days as a fractional executive, more retainer-based engagement. And ultimately that engagement is shaped from the initial work that I do to understand what it is that can be done to help a business to grow faster.
That's great. So you're really looking to find those growth drivers, the value drivers, help an organization unlock them in a really efficient, effective, scalable way. And you have strategic partnerships that bring complementary product suites and toolkits to amplify
exactly
your
right.
own coaching. That's great. What do clients say they love about you? So what's an example where you really helped a client unlock growth?
Well, I'd say that quantitatively, I would think that the clients would say that I've helped them to achieve better results. So starting with that, but I think that clients would likely tell you that particularly those that have worked with me for a period of time, that that I make them feel like they're my only customer. And I think they would tell you that I'm somebody that that's clinical in how they approach really the diagnosis. But then I'm somebody that has a really good bedside manner to help them figure out how to implement or use that diagnosis in a way that's going to help them.
Yeah, I think that's a winning 1-2 punch to have the blueprints, the playbook, but also help people navigate change and help them feel empowered. Because I think the environment can feel very disempowering right now.
Yeah, for sure.
What do you think about the advent of fractional executives? I work with lots of entrepreneurs, and I think that's a great lane for people to explore. What are your thoughts on that?
I absolutely believe that it is because increasingly more businesses are coming under pressure to grow and to grow profitably. Many businesses are reluctant to take on a full-time role, especially one that would be at a higher price point. And yet there are people like me who are out there who have years of experience and wisdom that they could offer to businesses out there and help them to achieve better results. And then I think you couple that with technology and increasingly with artificial intelligence driven tools. You as a fractional executive have the ability now to get more throughput than you ever did before through some of these tools and technologies, such that you can architect it, and then in many respects you can have tools do much of the work, whereas in even 5-10 years ago you would need a staff to do that.
Yeah, it's really the augmented human is really kind of where we're going. And go ahead.
And I think too, it's a really challenging time for those of us that are, in our late 40s and into our 50s. ageism is a real thing, and I think that a lot of businesses out there are reluctant to engage or take on employees once they reach a certain um, uh, tenure in their life, right? And this is a way I really believe that that what I'm doing now is going to extend my career by years because I have figured out how to package what it is that I can do in a way that would work for a business's P&L, and I'm continually figuring out how to deliver that work in a way that is repeatable for me. And ultimately, I think I'm going to be able to make or am making as good, if not better, a living than I would if I were working for an organization full time. And it also allows for the flexibility that many of us need at this stage of our lives.
Yeah, fractional roles really leverage what you know, and you're able to apply it in different contexts. And as someone whose formative training was at BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, a lot of the value of that training was constantly looking for the value drivers, the growth drivers in different contexts, and trying to identify the patterns. And so I think working fractionally, you're just constantly updating your game. You're seeing how AI is being used in more contexts to drive business cases, which is sort of the holy grail of AI now. We have this massive spend, but we're really struggling to formulate the business case, let alone see the ROI on the spend. And we're trying to bring in the responsible AI and all of the things, right? So right. I think, embracing older workers who've seen technology come and go and have seen disruption come and grow and have those patterns to advise from is something that everyone should really think about. So the other thing I'll add to that is whenever you're talking about getting a job as an older worker, you should say that you're open to contract work, right?
For sure.
Because it de-risks it for the employer, and they can try you out, and then they can discover, you know what? It's so great to have an adult in the room. It's so great to have someone who has 20 years of experience to draw on and can help us figure out what we really should be zooming in on. So I really think that's great. What would your advice be to new entrants joining the workplace? The college grads, the MBAs, the PhDs, because it's a really challenging job market, even for young talent.
It's a very challenging job market, and one of the things that that I do have concerns about for new job entrants or job market entrants is when I think back to my career, and I imagine you would probably be able to say the same thing. At that stage, I learned so much by watching other people who were successful or effective in what I was doing at the time, and in as much as I did doing it myself. And I'm concerned on a couple of levels that in a more virtual work environment that doesn't happen as frequently, and some of the work that somebody at an entry level position would have historically done maybe something that is being done by technology. So I've got those concerns. I would say, though, having said that, the advice I would give, especially in some of the spheres that I work in, is to really embrace technology.
Yeah.
And to explore some of the AI-driven tools that are available, such that you actually have at least a working understanding of them and can, over time, develop a command of those. Because I think those are the folks that are going to be most successful in the next 10 years. And I think there's a healthy cross section of people that are not doing that today. And so I think you can really differentiate yourself. And I think that younger people, and having spent a lot of time working at marketing agencies, it is one of the things that I love about it, is that you're constantly exposed to young people and new ideas and how they think, right? Which is different than how you and I grew up in our careers and our demographic, right? And I do believe that there's a level of creativity and just a more instinctive understanding of technology that exists in young people today, such that some of what I'm describing that has required me to, old dog learn new tricks, is just them figuring out what they probably do on a daily basis and apply it to work.
That's fantastic advice. Really make sure that you're showing your creativity and you're showing your curiosity and you're embracing change and you're curious about how can these new tools help us create more value, create faster growth.
And this last thing I'd say is me probably as a dad, and my kids would say, old man, put your phone down. Go shake somebody's hand, look them in the eye, right? Make a personal connection. I think that is certainly not a lost art, but it's something that I'd say in the time that I spend with young people, it's something that I notice immediately when I encounter someone who does that.
Snap. I love that you brought that in. Yes, embrace the technology, but remember we're humans and we connect as humans. And so building the relationship and showing up as someone who's curious and coachable is a great thing. And you have demonstrated your creativity and curiosity through all these different chapters of your life. We didn't even get into the fact that you have an MBA and a JD and have demonstrated a lot of curiosity. So we'll have to do that on the next time. So Dave, I want to close with what brings you hope?
What brings me hope? That's a great question. I'd say those moments where you see on a personal level, you see your kids shine. And what I mean by that is you see your kids do something where you're like, that might be their thing, or wow, that was amazing, or you actually have a conversation that's different than anything you've ever had before, right? Like those moments, I think as a dad, give me hope. I think that the days where I am able to say I worked out, I helped a client, I got out and coached my kids' team, right? And I'm exhausted at the end of the day, but I feel like I actually contributed something. Like that gives me hope. And then I think that those moments where I feel like I'm connecting with people in a real way, that gives me hope as well. There's certainly a lot out there that can make you feel hopeless, but I think those are the things for me that give me hope.
Yeah, I love how you brought it full circle, that you started with becoming a father and then talked about a lot of your hope is about the beauty of the future generation. And when you have those serendipitous moments where your kids show you who they are or who they're becoming, and you couldn't have imagined it, it's so true. And so I think what I'm taking from today's lessons from you is to really focus on curiosity, creativity, and to use them in service of others, advocating for others, and always stay hopeful and stay connected on a human level. So Dave, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. You're such a value-centered leader, and I'm very excited to hear more about DNA Business Consulting, and thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Katie, and thank you for all that you do. You are truly the impact whisperer. I can speak to that personally.
I love that. Thank you. All right. Talk soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.